Chapter 1. The Padawan Who Remained. Tonight is not a story about Darth Maul. No, tonight we begin with a girl. She is not quite a woman yet, not quite. She stands at the threshold. She is a Padawan learner of the Jedi Order. Her name is Devon Izara. But the Maker had a different vision for her, a darker vision, a vision named Darth Talon. She was traveling with her master on an ordinary night when Order 66 happened. Aboard a transport ship somewhere in the mid-rim, sitting cross-legged on her bunk with a data pad she was only half attending to, reviewing diagrams of lightsaber theory that her master had assigned her 3 days prior, and which she had been meaning to look at ever since without quite getting around to it. Her master was a Keldor named Devon Thoris, a gentle, methodical man with the deep calm of someone who has made peace with most of the galaxy's surprises. He was reading in the opposite bunk. He looked up at her once over the top of his data pad, and he smiled. She was memorizing that smile without knowing it. That is the nature of last things, my dear subject. You never know while they are happening that you are keeping them forever. I will not linger long on what followed. You may know the broad shape of it. Order 66. The night the clones turned, the Jedi dying in their temples and on their battlefields, and in transports moving through the mid-rim on ordinary nights. Each of those deaths was a person, a reader of data pads, a maker of small comforts, a master who had just smiled at his Padawan from across a bunk. Devon Thoris died in the corridor outside their compartment. Devon heard it. She pressed herself against the wall in the space beneath her bunk, and she was very quiet and very still. And what saved her in those first minutes was not skill or cunning, but the particular stillness of someone who understands, at a level below thought, that the world has just ended, and they are somehow still in it. That they are still breathing when they should perhaps not be. She ran, my young one. That is the story of the Padawans who survived. The ones who were traveling, who were away from the temples, who were young enough and quick enough and lucky enough that the execution order found them in the wrong place to be efficiently killed. They ran. Devon ran. She cut the Padawan braid from the side of her head with a utility knife, and she dropped it into the recycler, and she watched it disappear, and she felt something follow it into the dark. Not just braided hair, but a name, an identity, a version of herself that was no longer safe to be. She was no longer a Padawan. She was not yet anything else. She was, in the vocabulary of the galaxy's newly restructured understanding of itself, nobody. Devon Izara is still out there, as the story develops, still moving through the early empire, still carrying her lightsaber in a hidden compartment, still feeling the force flicker at the edges of her awareness when she is least prepared for it, still asking the question that every survivor of a great catastrophe eventually has to ask. What is left of me, and what do I do with what remains? We will come back to her, my dear subject. Her story is unfinished, and unfinished stories have a way of completing themselves eventually through the patient pressure of time. But tonight I want to take you somewhere further, much further along the river of time than the early empire, further than the rebellion, further than the new republic and all its long and hopeful and complicated decades of reconstruction. Back into the legends of this galaxy far, far away. More than 130 years after the Battle of Yavin, my young one. Into an age that the scholars of that distant era call the Legacy. A time when the Skywalker name is still famous, still heavy with the weight of everything it has always carried. When the galaxy has been through several more cycles of war and recovery, and fragile peace, and then war again. When Jedi exist but in reduced numbers, and Sith exist in a form that none of the old chronicles anticipated. When an empire rules again, not Palpatine's empire, not the familiar thing with its grey uniforms and its stormtroopers, but something older and stranger wearing the empire's face. It is an age of old things wearing new faces, my dear subject. The galaxy is very good at that. It never quite invents anything new. It only recombines what already was. And in that age, in the long, complicated darkness of the legacy, there is a woman I want you to meet. Her name is Darth Talon. Her skin is a lustful red, a Lethan Twi'lek through and through. From birth, all the way down to the marrow of her, a shade so deep and saturated that she seems, in certain lights, to be composed of something other than ordinary flesh. And over that natural red she has been tattooed. Sith script in black, flowing from the crown of her head all the way down the length of her leku, across her shoulders, down her arms, over every surface of her. She is, in a very literal sense, a text, a living inscription. What the words say, if you could read them, and few can, is something like, I belong to darkness, I was made for this, I am exactly what I appear to be. That kind of certainty is rare, my young one. Most people are uncertain about who they are, what they want, whether the things they believe are worth what believing them costs. Devon Izara is uncertain in the profound way of someone who has survived the demolition of everything she was trained to be. She does not know, standing in the wreckage of the Jedi Order, what she is supposed to do with the rest of her life, or whether the Force is still a gift, or has become something else entirely. Darth Talon has no such problem. She was given her identity the way a blade is given its edge, through the careful, deliberate application of heat and pressure over a very long time, until what remained was exactly the instrument intended. She does not wonder what she is. She was never allowed to wonder, and she does not miss the wondering. They are a study in contrasts, these two. Devon Izara shaped by loss, by the sudden, total destruction of the structure she was raised within, and by the long, hard question of what remains when everything that organized a life has been taken away. Darth Talon shaped by construction, by the deliberate building of an identity from the ground up, under a master who knew exactly what he was making. Both of them carry something that the world around them does not easily accommodate. And both of them are, in their very different ways, alone. Devon, in her anonymity, invisible to a galaxy that no longer knows what a Jedi is. Talon at the right hand of a Dark Lord, surrounded by those who serve the same master, and nevertheless entirely alone inside herself. The solitude of someone shaped so completely that there is no room left for surprise. That is the theme that threads through both their stories, my dear subject. The question of what becomes of a person when the world strips away or never offers the usual scaffolding of identity. Devon Izara lost her master, her order, her name. Darth Talon was never given any of those things to lose. Different wounds, different kinds of alone, and yet the question is the same. What are you at the bottom of it all? What is left when everything else has been taken or withheld? Tonight, in the dark, we need only a beginning. Devon Izara, surviving in the early empire. Darth Talon, more than a century away, patient in a red cave on a red planet, covered in words that declare exactly what she is. Tomorrow I will tell you more. The galaxy they inhabit, the man who built Talon's empire, the long process by which darkness educates a person into something extraordinary and terrible. Tonight, you need only rest with their shapes in your mind. Sleep, my dear subject. The story will be here when you return. Chapter 2. A galaxy older than memory. Come back to me, my young one. Close your eyes again and let the day recede, and listen. Last night I set a scene for you at the very edge of time. I pointed at a future 130 years distant and said, "There, that is where we are going." Tonight I want to take you there properly. I want to describe for you the world that Darth Talon was born into, so that you understand not just who she is, but what she is made of. And what she is made of, my dear subject, is a galaxy in the throes of a particular kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of worlds that have been at war for so long that they have begun to forget what they were fighting about, and keep fighting anyway, because they have forgotten how to do anything else. Let me paint the picture for you slowly, the way I like to paint pictures, with care and attention to the details that matter. It is the year 137, by the reckoning of years after the Battle of Yavin, the great battle you know from other stories, the one with the Death Star and the young farm boy and the torpedoes in the exhaust port. That was a long time ago in this age. 137 years. Every person who was alive that day is long dead. The galaxy they died to save has been through several more cycles of catastrophe since then. The Yuuzhan Vong came, a great extragalactic invasion, a species of beings who existed outside the Force and who reshaped worlds with living weapons and who very nearly won. They did not quite win. But the winning cost something that no victory can fully repay. After the Vong War, the galaxy recovered slowly, as galaxies do, pulling itself together from the wreckage with the stubborn persistence that is perhaps the galaxy's most reliable quality. The Galactic Alliance rose from the remnants of the New Republic. The empire that had persisted since Palpatine's death, diminished, reformed, ruled now by a dynasty called Fel, from the name of the man who first gave the imperial remnant something like honor, found a kind of uneasy coexistence with the Alliance. Not peace, precisely, not the warm, uncomplicated peace of people who trust one another, but the practiced coexistence of powers that have learned to maintain their boundary lines. It is a kind of peace, my dear subject, imperfect and contingent and expensive to maintain, but real. For a while, nothing lasts forever. That is a truth I tell my listeners often, not to be grim, but because it is foundational. Because if you understand that nothing lasts forever, you are much better prepared for the moment when the specific thing you were counting on to last forever reveals its mortality. The uneasy peace between the Alliance and the Fel Empire lasted for decades, long enough that people began, as they always do, to take it for granted. Long enough that the defenses loosened just slightly, and the watchfulness relaxed just slightly, and the old institutions accumulated just slightly too much confidence in their own permanence. And in that space, in that tiny, crucial gap between what people expected and what was actually happening, something old and patient had been waiting. The One Sith. That is what they called themselves. Not the rule of two, Not the old Sith order with its two practitioners, one master and one apprentice, a long chain of betrayal and succession stretching back centuries. Something different. Something that was built on a different philosophy, a different architecture, a different understanding of what darkness could be if it organized itself cleverly. One master, absolute, unchallengeable, the center around which everything revolved, but many Sith, dozens, hundreds eventually, an entire order of darkness, operating in secret in the caves of Korriban and in the underworlds of 100 planets, biding its time with a patience that the old Sith orders had never managed to sustain. And at the center of all of it, one man. A man who had been alive for more than a century. A man who remembered the Clone Wars from personal experience. A man who had been a Jedi once and had carried the Force like a bright thing inside him and had lost it. Or rather, had given it over to something else, traded it in the way desperate people trade things of great value for things of immediate need. His name, now, was Darth Krayt. But that was not the name he had been born with, my dear subject, and it was not the name he had trained under as a young Jedi on the fields of a republic that no longer existed. His original name was Asharad Het, and his story is one I will tell you in full in the chapter that follows this one. For now, know only that he was patient. Very, very patient. Darth Krayt's patience bore fruit in the year 92, after the Battle of Yavin, the year his Sith made their move against the galaxy. It was not an invasion in the conventional sense. There were no fleets massing on the border. There was no declaration of war, no ultimatum, no moment when the galaxy could have seen what was coming and braced for it. Instead, there was a series of decisions made by individuals at crucial moments. Decisions that were not entirely their own, influenced by shadows and suggestions, and the long, patient cultivation of connections in the right places. The galaxy did not fall to Darth Krayt's Sith in a single battle, my young one. It fell the way old things fall, gradually and then suddenly, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already done. By the year 130, the Sith had seized the throne of the Empire. Not the Alliance, not yet, but the Empire which they had undermined and hollowed out over decades from within. Darth Krayt sat where Emperor Fel had sat, and the stormtroopers wore new insignia, and the galaxy looked at the shape of what had happened and began, very slowly, to understand that the darkness had returned. That it had never really left. That it had simply been patient in the way that darkness always is. Patient and watchful and willing to wait as long as it took for the moment when patience becomes action. This is the world that Darth Talon was born into, my dear subject. Or rather, born near the edge of, the way people are born near the edge of things, aware that the great machinery exists, shaped by its gravity, but not yet part of its inner workings. She was born into the long preparation, into the decades before Krayt's conquest, when the One Sith was still secret and still building, still weaving their network and training their operatives and waiting for the exact right moment. She was born into Korriban's caves and Korriban's darkness and Korriban's ancient teaching, and the galaxy outside that darkness was something she was educated about rather than something she experienced. She was made for the conquest. She was ready when it came. Korriban. Let me tell you about Korriban, my young one. because it is the ground that grew Darth Talon, and the ground matters. It is a red world, and so it is fitting that it would produce a red woman, is it not? Korriban is ancient beyond any age you have learned to reckon. It was old when the Republic was young. It is the original Sith world, the world of tombs and dark echoes, and the concentrated weight of generations of dark side practice layered into the stone like sediment. The Valley of the Dark Lords, they have always called its most famous canyon, a place of great mausoleums carved into red cliffs, where Sith lords of a dozen different eras are interred with their ambitions still intact. Death does not diminish darkness on Korriban. It preserves it, concentrates it, lets it breathe in the dark for a few thousand years. This is where Darth Talon was raised, my dear subject. In that red world, in those ancient caves, under the weight of all that preserved darkness. The One Sith used Korriban as their sanctum during the long preparation years. It was remote. It was already drenched in dark side energy that masked their presence from any Jedi who might be looking, and it had a quality of absolute seriousness that suited the Enterprise. You do not go to Korriban to be casual about things. You go to Korriban to be consumed by them. To let the dark side work on you the way time works on stone, slowly, completely, until the shape you end up with is not the shape you started with, but is more itself, more final, more exactly what it was always going to be. That, my young one, is where tonight's story lives. In that red world, in that ancient darkness, in the long, patient preparation of Darth Krayt's One Sith, and the woman who emerges from that preparation, the one covered in red skin and black script, certain of herself in a way that most beings spend their entire lives trying and failing to achieve. She is still a few chapters away, still being made. But the world that made her is here around us now, and it is good, I think, to understand the soil before we describe the flower. Even when the flower is a dangerous one, even when it is the kind of flower that has thorns all the way down, that was never meant to be held without bleeding. Rest now, my young one. Let the red world settle around you. Let Korriban's ancient patience work on you the way it works on everything that spends time in its shadow. Breathe. Sleep. The dark is very old and very wide, and it has room for you. Chapter 3. The Man Who Walked into the Dark. Welcome back, my young one. Let the darkness settle around you like warm water, and listen. Tonight I must tell you about a man whose story stretches across more years than most lives contain. A man who began as one thing and became, through the grinding machinery of loss and war and terrible choice, something entirely different. His name at the beginning was Asharad Het. His name at the end was Darth Krayt. And between those two names, my dear subject, lies one of the longest and most painful journeys in the galaxy's history. I will take you through it slowly. It deserves that. Even a story about the creation of a Dark Lord deserves care in the telling. Asharad Het was born on Tatooine. You know Tatooine, perhaps? The desert world, the twin suns, the place that appears again and again in the galaxy's history with the reliability of a place that sits at the intersection of important things. His father was Sharad Het, a Jedi master who had retired from the Order to live among the Tusken Raiders, those desert people whom many dismissed as primitive, but who had a culture as deep and enduring as the dunes themselves. His mother was a Tusken woman. Asharad grew up between two worlds, the Jedi tradition his father carried and taught him, and the Tusken tradition of the community that surrounded him. He could survive in the deep desert. He spoke the language of a people most Jedi never bothered to learn. He knew how to be more than one thing, which is its own kind of power. He was eventually taken to the Jedi Temple and formally trained, the way Jedi children were trained in those days, in the communal way, with a master who took him as a Padawan and taught him the deeper disciplines of the Force. He became a skilled fighter, a skilled diplomat, a man who carried the desert's patience into the Order's corridors and was a little strange for it, a little different, in a way that made him effective in places where the more conventional Jedi were not. He fought in the Clone Wars. He fought in the way Jedi fought in those years, at the head of clone battalions, moving across desperate ground, trying to hold together something that was, though none of them knew it yet, already falling apart. Order 66 found him in the Outer Rim. That was, in the purely accidental logic of survival, the thing that saved him. Distance. He was far enough from the concentrated killing that he had a moment to understand what was happening before it was too late. The clones around him turned, as the clones everywhere turned, and Asharad Het did what he had been trained for the desert to make him do. He ran. Not in panic, not in the stumbling flight of someone unprepared. With the deliberate, controlled retreat of someone who knows when a position cannot be held and who values survival above the pride of dying where he stands. He had learned that from the Tuskens, too, that survival is not cowardice, and that the living can still act when the dead cannot. He returned to Tatooine. For a time, he lived again as a Tusken in the deep desert, trying to reconstitute himself from the wreckage of what the galaxy had done to the Order and to him. But the desert, patient as it is, cannot hold a man who is looking for somewhere to direct his anger indefinitely. Asharad Het was angry, my dear subject. Not hot angry, not immediately, not the reactive anger of the young, but cold angry, deep angry, the way people are angry when they have had time to turn their grief into something with harder edges. The Jedi were gone. The Republic was gone. Everything he had been trained to serve had been dismantled, and the galaxy that replaced it was cruel and imperial and had no use for what he was. He began looking for what he could still be. What followed was a long journey. I will compress it for you, my young one, because some of the stations on that journey are places I do not want to linger. Not tonight, in the dark, when the point is to rest and not to distress. He encountered dark side influences. He was drawn toward anger and toward the power that anger channeled correctly could provide. He spent years in paths that drifted further and further from what he had been trained to be, until the man who had grown up between Jedi discipline and Tusken patience was a memory, and what remained was something harder and colder and more willing. Then came the Yuuzhan Vong, the Great Invasion. The species from outside the galaxy who existed beyond the Force's reach, who remade planets with living tools, who tortured their enemies for reasons that had nothing to do with information and everything to do with their theology. Asharad Het was captured by the Vong. He was tortured. What they did to him in those captivity years is the kind of thing that leaves a person with two choices. They break or they rebuild around the damage, and the rebuilding changes the shape of them permanently. He did not break. But what he built around the damage was not the thing he had been before. They implanted him with Vong coral, living tissue that bonded to his body and began slowly to spread through him. The galaxy's most intimate invasion working from the inside out. Even when he escaped, the Vong was still in him, would always be in him, growing. A slow death timed by a biology that did not care about his plans. He learned to live with that clock ticking. He came to Korriban. This is the pivot, my dear subject. This is the moment when Asharad Het walks into one room and something else walks out. On Korriban, among the ancient tombs and the concentrated darkness, he found what the old Sith had left behind. Not just artifacts and knowledge, but a philosophy. An understanding of power that the Jedi had always taught him to fear, but which, from inside the Vong's damage, looked rather different than the Jedi had described it. The dark side was not what had killed the Order. The dark side had been present in the galaxy long before the Order died, and the Order had survived. What had killed the Order was a specific man with a specific plan executed with specific ruthlessness. Darkness itself was just a force, a fact, a medium. What you did with it was a different question. He spent decades on Korriban and in its surroundings, studying, building, thinking. He began to gather others, force-sensitive beings who, for various reasons, had no place in the Jedi Order and no desire to become the kind of lone practitioner the old rule of two produced. He offered them something different, a community, a purpose, a discipline that was demanding and dark, but that did not require them to be alone. The One Sith took its shape slowly, the way the most dangerous things take shape, so gradually that by the time it was recognizable as what it was, it had already put down roots too deep to easily pull. By the time Asharad Het had fully become Darth Krayt, by the time the name Asharad Het was something he no longer answered to, he had built something that the galaxy had no vocabulary for, an empire of shadows. Hidden within the hidden corners of the galaxy's existing power structures, biding its time, training its children, growing its numbers, waiting for the moment, always, always waiting for the moment when patience becomes the right to act. He had that kind of patience, my dear subject. He had bought it at an extraordinary price. The Vong implants were still in him, still spreading, still measuring out his remaining time in biological installments. And rather than accelerating, rather than striking before the clock ran out, Darth Krayt simply incorporated that urgency into the stillness, used it as a kind of fuel. Every day that he waited was a day closer to the end, and every day closer to the end was a day more worth making count. This is the man who trained Darth Talon. Not personally, in all the specifics. She had many teachers in the One Sith, many masters who shaped her particular disciplines. But Krayt was the vision that organized everything, the architecture within which all the training took place. When Darth Talon was educated in the dark side, she was educated in his dark side, his particular understanding of what power was for and how it should be used and what it demanded of the people who held it. She was made in his image, in a sense. Not literally. She looks nothing like a weathered former Jedi who has been Vong modified nearly beyond recognition. But philosophically, fundamentally, in the ways that matter. Rest now, my young one. Let this man settle in your mind. This long, damaged, patient, extraordinary figure who turned his every catastrophe into a stone in a wall he was building, slowly towards something the galaxy would eventually be unable to ignore. He is not a hero, and the kindly king will not pretend that he is. But he is a person of genuine and unusual will, and that is worth acknowledging before we move on to the thing he built. Tomorrow we meet the woman who was trained in his philosophy, the Red Woman, the inscribed one. But tonight, let Darth Krayt's story work on you the way long stories work. Not all at once, but in layers, each one settling over the one before it, building up over time into something that has weight. Sleep, my dear subject. The dark is patient. And so, tonight, are we. Chapter 4. Born in Crimson. Come, my young one. Let the story find you in the quiet. I have been describing the world, the age, the man who built the empire within the empire, the slow architecture of Darth Krayt's long patience. Tonight, we step closer to the woman at the center of our story. Tonight, we ask the question, how does Darth Talon begin? Every person has a beginning, even those who seem, by the time you encounter them, to have existed forever in their completed form. Darth Talon, covered in red skin and black inscription, certain and deliberate and utterly without doubt about what she is, she was not always that. She was once a child. Even the most terrible things are children once. That is worth remembering. Lethan Twi'leks are rare. Let me tell you what that means, my dear subject, because rarity is often misunderstood. People treat it as merely a matter of quantity, when it is more properly a matter of meaning. There are many things in the galaxy that exist in small numbers. The significance of scarcity is not the scarcity itself, but what the scarcity signals, that something unusual has occurred, that the normal machinery of the universe has deviated from its usual course, that whatever force governs such deviations has decided, for reasons it does not explain, to make something that was not supposed to exist. Lethan Twi'leks, those rare individuals born with the deep red pigmentation that sets them apart even from their red-tinted kin, carry that sense of markedness about them. They are noticed. They are remarked upon. She was noticed very early. This is how the story begins, as best as it can be reconstructed. An infant on Korriban, or brought to Korriban in infancy, or identified in the early years of childhood and taken to the place where the One Sith trained their young. The mechanics of how Talon came to Korriban are less important than the fact of her arrival and what that arrival meant. A child who could feel the Force, brought to a place that was entirely organized around the education of Force-sensitive people in a very specific direction. She had no memory of any other world. She had no reference for what the galaxy looked like from outside Korriban's red cliffs and ancient corridors. She did not know what it meant to be not Sith, because she had never been offered anything else to be. There is a particular kind of childhood that consists entirely of preparation. Not childhood in the sense of play and exploration and the gradual tentative discovery of what the world is and what you are in it, but childhood as the deliberate shaping of a specific capacity, the way a craftsman shapes an object over time, every day organized around practice, every lesson oriented toward a single goal. It sounds austere, my dear subject, and it was. The One Sith did not believe in what they called softness, the indulgences of an ordinary upbringing, the comfort of uncertainty, the luxury of not knowing yet what you are. Every child trained in Krayt's order knew from the beginning what they were going to become. The question was not what, but how completely. Talon trained. That is the most direct way to say it. She trained in the disciplines of the Force, in the use of telekinesis, in the projection of dark side energy, in the reading of others' emotions and intentions through the Force's connection to all living things. She trained in physical combat, the precise acrobatic fighting style that would become her signature, the blade forms that she studied until they were not separate from her, but part of her, the way breathing is part of a body. She trained in the deeper philosophies of Darth Krayt's particular Sith understanding, the rule of one, the idea that service to a greater will was not a diminishment of self, but an expression of it, that the highest thing a Sith could be was an instrument of something larger than any individual ambition. She found this convincing. She was trained to find it convincing, and she did. The tattoos began at some point during her training. This is one of the aspects of Talon's story that is difficult to describe without pausing to appreciate what it means. Because the tattooing of a Sith in this tradition is not decoration. It is not aesthetic, not primarily. It is inscription. It is the physical marking of identity, the visible manifestation of a commitment that is otherwise invisible. When a member of the One Sith is tattooed in Sith script, what is being written on them is not a record of who they are, but a declaration of what they have given themselves over to. It is a permanent statement, I belong to this. This is not something I am trying or sampling or considering. This is what I am. There is no removing Sith tattoos, my dear subject. The removal of a tattoo, even if it were possible, would not remove what the tattoo represents. Imagine the young Talon in those sessions then. The red of her skin, so unusual, so immediately striking. The Sith scribes who did the work would have found it remarkable, marking that crimson surface with black characters that stood out with perfect clarity against it, as though the contrast had been planned, as though a canvas had been made ready for exactly this text. Each character placed with intention, each session a meditation as much as a physical procedure. The pain of it incorporated into the work, not incidentally but as part of the meaning, because the One Sith believed, as many dark side traditions have believed, that physical endurance is not separate from spiritual discipline, that the body's capacity to absorb and persist through pain is part of what makes a Sith. She endured it. She was not passive in it. She was present in it, attending to it, learning from the sensation what she could learn. There was a trial, as there is always a trial. The specific shape of the One Sith's trials were different from the old Sith trials, which typically involved betraying or defeating one's master in some way. That old rule of two logic, where succession was earned through treachery. Under Krayt's rule of one, the trial was different. It was a test not of dominance over one's master, but of absolute commitment to the mission. Could you be trusted to serve the larger purpose without individual ambition distorting the service? Could you hold power without turning it toward yourself? This sounds almost virtuous in a way, and the kindly king wants to be careful not to make it sound more admirable than it was. The power being renounced was renounced in service of something that was itself a bid for total domination. It is not humility. It is a different kind of ambition. But it required a different kind of discipline. She passed her trial. Of course she did. We know this because she survived to become what she became. But I want you to understand that the passing was not a foregone conclusion, my dear subject, even if the confidence that Talon would eventually display might suggest otherwise. The trial was real, the threat was real. The One Sith did not retain members who could not pass it. The galaxy was too large, the mission too long-term to carry near misses. Talon passed because she had been made precisely for passing. Because every year of training, every tattooed character, every meditative hour in Korriban's dark had been a preparation for exactly this moment, and she had not wasted a single one of those hours. She was the trial's intended outcome. She had always been the trial's intended outcome, and she arrived at it completely ready. And then she was Darth Talon. Not in name only. The name was given as part of the formalization, in the way that Sith names are given, as a replacement for the birth name that no one uses anymore. But the name was a recognition of something that had already occurred, not a cause of it. Darth Talon existed before anyone said the words aloud. She had been accumulating in that red body and that tattooed skin across all the years of training, a specific identity assembling itself piece by piece, and when it was assembled, it was unmistakable. You looked at her, and you did not wonder what she was. There was no ambiguity. The clarity was total. It is a strange thing to say about someone, my dear subject, but I will say it. She was complete, in the way that a finished thing is complete. No missing pieces, no rough edges, everything that she was intended to be, fully present. Rest with that image, my young one. The young Twi'lek, red as the planet that made her, covered now in the black script of her commitment, standing in the caves of Korriban with the weight of 100 years of patient preparation around her, and something in her chest that is not peace exactly, but is certainty, which is the closest thing to peace that the dark side philosophy she was raised in permits. Devon Izara, in her hiding place in the early empire, has nothing like that certainty. She has doubt and grief and the Force flickering at her like a candle in a wind she cannot stop. They are such different people, made from such different materials, and yet they are both, in their way, made. Both of them the result of forces much larger than themselves. Both of them, whether they chose it or not, products of their age. Sleep now, my dear subject. Let the darkness be gentle. Let Korriban recede into the middle distance. Sleep. Chapter 5. The Education of Darkness. Here you are again, my young one. I am glad. Pull the blanket higher and let your breathing slow, and let the day release you, as the day always must eventually release you, into the dark that is not empty but full of the long, patient resonance of stories working on you while you sleep. Tonight we descend a little further into the world that made Darth Talon. We have described her childhood, the raw material of it, the red world, the ancient darkness, the tattooing, the trial. Tonight I want to describe the education itself, what it meant to be trained in the One Sith, what it cost, what it gave, what it did to a person who underwent it fully and without resistance. I want you to understand, my dear subject, that I am not celebrating this. I am describing it. There is a difference, and I hold to it. The One Sith's training philosophy was built on a foundation that Darth Krayt had spent decades constructing from the ruins of things he had studied and discarded. He had studied the old rule of two carefully, had seen its logic, its elegance, its fatal flaw. The rule of two produced powerful Sith. It also produced Sith who, at the critical moment, had no choice but to betray. The master killed the apprentice who was growing too strong. The apprentice killed the master once strong enough. Every succession was a murder. The tradition fed on itself. And Krayt, who was thinking not in terms of the next 20 years, but the next 200, needed something that could outlast any individual. He needed an institution. He needed, paradoxically, a Sith order that functioned like an order. Like the Jedi Order, in its deepest structural sense, but oriented toward darkness. The Rule of One said, "There is one master, Darth Krayt, the Dark Lord, the center around which everything revolves. And there are many Sith, and the many Sith do not compete with each other for the title of master. They serve." That single word, serve, is the hinge on which the whole philosophy turns. And it requires examination because it meant something very specific to Krayt. Not servitude in the degrading sense, not the service of a slave who has no choice. The service of an instrument that is proud of its precision, that understands its function in a larger mechanism, that finds meaning not in individual glory, but in the perfection of its particular role. There is a kind of freedom in that, Krayt would argue, the freedom of having no doubt about what you are for. Talon's training in this philosophy was not merely theoretical. She did not sit in a room and listen to lectures about the nature of service and the philosophy of unified will. She practiced it, the way everything in the One Sith was practiced, through the body, through the doing, through the application of the lesson until the lesson ceased to be a lesson and became simply the way things were. She was given tasks that required her to subordinate her own preferences to the needs of a larger purpose. She was given commands that she was required to follow without the luxury of understanding why. Not blindly. The One Sith were not mindless, and blind obedience was not what Krayt wanted. He wanted informed, intelligent, capable agents who chose service because they understood its value. The training was designed to produce that choice, freely made. Though one might ask, my dear subject, how free a choice is when it has been carefully engineered from infancy. The physical training was extraordinary. This is one of the things the historical record is clearest on. For those who study that era, the level of physical capability the One Sith demanded of their practitioners was exceptional even by the standards of Force users, who are themselves exceptional by the standards of anyone without the Force. Talon trained in acrobatics that took the Force's enhanced agility to its furthest expression, leaps and tumbles and wall running, and the kind of three-dimensional movement that makes a fight feel like something between combat and dance. She trained in blade work, 2 red blades eventually, carried in the twin handles that would become recognizable to everyone who ever faced her. Form 7, in its darkest interpretation, augmented with her own innovations, refined to an edge. She was also trained in the Force directly. Telekinesis precise enough to stop a blade mid-swing. Force lightning controlled enough to incapacitate without killing when killing was not the goal. And woven through all of it was the dark side itself. The Force, in its dark aspect, the anger and passion and drive that the Jedi always taught to be feared and suppressed, the Sith always taught to be embraced and channeled. Talon did not have the Jedi's relationship to this question, my dear subject. She had never been taught to fear it. She had never had a master who warned her away from her own passions, who said, "Be careful, these feelings are dangerous. They will consume you if you let them." She had been taught the opposite, that passions correctly channeled are the fuel for power, and power correctly directed is the currency of the galaxy. She did not struggle with the darkness. She swam in it. It was the medium in which she existed, as natural to her as water to a creature born in the sea. There was beauty in it too, from a certain angle. I want to be honest about that. It would be dishonest to describe Talon's training as purely grim, as though nothing in it could be found worthwhile. There was mastery, the real satisfaction of a body trained to extraordinary capability, a mind honed to sharpness, understanding of the Force at a depth few practitioners ever achieved. There was community, in the strange way the One Sith had it. Beings who understood each other in the most fundamental way, who shared discipline and purpose. The dark side, at Talon's level, had an intensity the Jedi path did not quite offer. It demanded everything, and when it received everything, it gave back something commensurate. She learned about Darth Krayt himself during these years, not as an abstract authority, not merely as the name at the top of the hierarchy she existed within, but as a person, or what a person becomes when they have survived what Krayt survived and built what Krayt built. The Vong implants were part of what she learned about. The spreading coral that was slowly consuming him, the biological clock that ticked within the Dark Lord who had been patient for a century and was now, finally, facing the one enemy that patience alone could not defeat. She understood that his need for healing was not weakness, it was the cost of his endurance. Every year that he had survived with those implants spreading through him was a year bought at significant price, and the debt was accumulating. He needed a healer of extraordinary power. That knowledge was filed away in Talon, as knowledge is filed in well-trained minds, silently, precisely, available when needed. Her training concluded, or rather moved from formal training into the ongoing education of service, which is a different thing. A Sith who has passed their trials does not stop learning. They begin learning in earnest, in the way that classroom knowledge becomes real knowledge only when it is applied to actual situations that do not cooperate with classroom assumptions. Talon was given missions. Small ones at first, reconnaissance, the gathering of information, the quiet removal of obstacles that stood in the One Sith's long path toward its goals. She performed them with the precision you would expect of someone who had been trained the way she had been trained. And with each mission, she became more completely herself, more certain, more finished. The doubt that most beings carry through their lives like a stone in a shoe, she had none of it. And that, my young one, is either the most enviable thing or the saddest thing, depending on where you stand when you consider it. Let me tell you something that the kindly king has observed in all his years of watching the galaxy turn and people live and choose and become. Certainty and peace are not the same thing. They resemble each other from a distance, and this causes considerable confusion. A person who is absolutely certain about what they are and what they are doing looks from the outside as though they have achieved something admirable, the equanimity that most people spend their lives searching for. But equanimity and certainty are built on different foundations. Equanimity is the peace of someone who has sat with uncertainty long enough that they are no longer threatened by it. Certainty is the stillness of someone who has never been allowed to move. One of those is a freedom, my dear subject. The other is a room with no windows, rendered comfortable by the fact that you have never seen the outside. Darth Talon had certainty. We have established that clearly enough. And in the chapters that follow, we will see what that certainty does when it meets the world. when it is tested by something that the training did not fully prepare for, something that didn't fit the patterns she had been taught to expect. For now, rest with the image of her, fully formed. Every discipline acquired, every lesson internalized, every tattoo's meaning fully inhabited. Standing in Korriban's ancient darkness, waiting for the next command, absolutely ready. Completely certain. And somewhere impossibly far away in time, Devon Izara is uncertain in a dark transport corridor, uncertain about everything, carrying the Force like a wound and her master's memory like a stone. They are both waiting, my young one, in their different ways, both waiting for what comes next. As are we all. As are we all. Sleep now. Chapter 6. The Hands of the Dark Lord. Come back to the dark, my young one. The story is deepening now. We are in the middle chapters, which are always the chapters where the characters become most themselves, where the training and the backstory begin to show in the way they move and speak and decide. Tonight, I want to tell you about Darth Talon's place in the world she was trained for, about what it meant to be one of Darth Krayt's hands. The word hand carries weight in the Sith tradition. It echoes back through centuries to the Emperor's hands in Palpatine's day, those elite agents who served the Emperor personally and operated outside the normal chains of command. The word says, I am the reach of something greater than myself. I am the place where the Master's will touches the world. It is a particular kind of intimacy, being a hand, not warmth, not anything so ordinary as warmth, but proximity to power so absolute that it becomes its own kind of belonging. Darth Krayt had two hands. This was unusual. Most Dark Lords of Sith, in the old traditions, kept one hand, if any. Two was a choice that said something about Krayt's management style, about his understanding of how power is best extended across a galaxy that is very large and very complicated. One hand was Darth Nil, a being of a different species entirely, blue-skinned and tall, a Nagai male, a former mercenary who had come to the One Sith through a very different path than Talon, and who embodied a different kind of lethality, strategic, military, oriented toward large-scale operations. And the other hand was Darth Talon, who embodied something different, precision, intimacy, the kind of operation that requires a single extraordinary individual rather than a fleet. Krayt chose them carefully. He had spent a century building the One Sith, and in that century he had observed a great many Force-sensitive beings at their training and at their work, had developed an ability to recognize specific capacities that might look similar from the outside, but operated very differently in practice. Nil's strength was scope, the ability to understand situations as a whole and to direct large forces effectively. Talon's strength was depth, the ability to understand a specific target, a specific problem, with such completeness that no aspect of it could surprise her. Two kinds of intelligence, two kinds of power. A master who had survived as long as Krayt had survived understood that both were necessary and that they were not interchangeable. Her relationship with Krayt himself was complicated in ways that the simple word loyalty does not capture. Loyalty implies a choice, a weighing of alternatives, a moment when you could have chosen differently and chose this instead. Talon's relationship to Krayt was not quite loyalty in that sense. It was something more structural. It was the relationship of a creation to its creator, of an instrument to the intention that shaped it. She served him not because she had decided to serve him, but because service to him was what she was made for, as completely as a key is made for a specific lock. And yet, it was not nothing. It was not mere mechanism. Within that structure there was something that functioned like trust, something that functioned like regard. Krayt did not use Talon carelessly. He was not reckless with what he had spent years building, and Talon knew that. She felt the weight of that knowing. She was his representative in situations that required personal presence. This is the function of a hand, ultimately. The situations that a Dark Lord cannot or should not attend to directly, that require the credibility of direct representation. The situations where the difference between a message and a messenger is the difference between acknowledged and ignored. When Talon walked into a room, the room understood what she represented. Not just the visual impact of it, though that was considerable, red skin and black inscription in a galaxy of more conventional appearances, but the force of it. The dark side radiated from her in a way that trained practitioners felt immediately, and that untrained beings registered as a kind of atmospheric pressure, a feeling that the temperature had dropped slightly, that the light was a little less certain, that something in the room had become more serious without any words being spoken. She was, in her own person, a demonstration of Krayt's power. This was part of her function. Among the other members of the One Sith, that community of Sith who had been raised or recruited into Krayt's order across decades, her position generated a specific quality of regard. Respect, certainly. Every member of the One Sith had trained hard enough to understand what it cost to achieve what Talon had achieved. And that understanding produced a genuine recognition of her capability. Not envy, precisely. The One Sith's philosophy discouraged the competitive individualism that might have produced envy, but a clear acknowledgement of where she stood relative to where they stood. And alongside the respect, a kind of distance. Being the Master's hand placed her outside the ordinary hierarchy in a way that was real and felt, regardless of whether anyone articulated it. She had been elevated, and elevation creates its own kind of solitude. The solitude not of someone left behind, but of someone placed above others, and therefore inevitably apart from them. She did not find this uncomfortable. She had never been trained to find it uncomfortable. The other part of her function was more direct. Missions. Tasks that required a specific kind of capability. Not the broad military capability of Nil, but the precise personal capability of someone who could find a specific individual anywhere in the galaxy, engage that individual at their own level, and return with the desired outcome. The galaxy is full of extraordinary beings, my dear subject, full of people who are strong in the Force, or skilled in ways that make them hard to approach, or simply difficult to find because they have good reasons for not being found. Talon had a particular gift for finding people who did not want to be found, for understanding them well enough from a distance that she could predict their movements, anticipate their choices, place herself at the intersection of where they would be and when. It was a kind of empathy in its own dark way. She was also, in the quieter spaces of her function, a presence that reminded the rest of the One Sith of what they were serving. An order of hundreds of Sith, operating in secret across many planets, requires a kind of institutional coherence, a shared understanding of the mission and the Master that does not drift or fragment over time. Talon, as Krayt's hand, was one of the ways that coherence was maintained. Her presence among other Sith was a reminder. This is what the One Sith produces at its highest expression. This is the standard. Look at her. There was an aspirational quality to her that she herself would probably not have described in those terms, but which functioned that way. The other Sith looked at her and saw the completion of the project they were all engaged in. The galaxy, of course, had a very different perspective. To the galaxy, to the populations of the planets that now existed under the banner of Darth Krayt's Sith Empire, Darth Talon was a figure of legend or nightmare, or both. Stories traveled. The red woman covered in black marks, who moved like water and who hit like stone, who had a talent for appearing exactly where you had hoped she would not appear. Some of the stories exaggerated, some of them, if anything, understated. The difficulty of exaggerating Darth Talon was that reality provided substantial competition. She had, in the years since her elevation to the role of Hand, accumulated a record that was not entirely comfortable to summarize in casual conversation. Not because she was reckless, she was never reckless, because she was effective. I want to tell you something that I have been circling around, my dear subject, and which I think is worth saying directly. Darth Talon was not a monster. I know that the convenient vocabulary of stories like this tends toward monsters, toward beings who are simply evil, who do evil things because their nature is entirely evil, whose inner lives, if they have them, are simply versions of the evil they project outward. Talon was not that. She was a person, a specific, unusual, highly capable person who had been shaped by specific, unusual, deeply formative experiences. She had desires, though they were not the desires most people recognize as such. She had something that functioned as satisfaction when a mission was completed well. She had something that functioned as regard for the being she served. She was not, in her own experience, a creature of cruelty for its own sake. She was a creature of purpose. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that the purpose was a terrible one. And now comes the mission. The chapter that will define how the galaxy at large comes to know Darth Talon. Not through the accumulated evidence of her previous operations, which were discrete and deniable, but through a single, specific, impossible-seeming task. Find Cade Skywalker. Cade Skywalker, who does not want to be found, who has been running from his name and his inheritance for a decade, who has made himself as invisible as a man with his face and his bloodline can make himself. A man whose healing ability is the only thing in the galaxy capable of buying Darth Krayt more time against the thing that is consuming him from within. That mission, that target. We will come to it. But tonight, let the shape of Talon's role settle into you. Let her place in the larger machinery become clear. Rest now. The story is turning toward its center. Sleep. Chapter 7. The Skywalker Problem. Here we are, my young one. The fire is low and the dark is deep, and I have been waiting for you, as I always wait, in the patient manner of someone who has no appointments that cannot be rescheduled indefinitely. Tonight we arrive at the mission, the task that sends Darth Talon out into the galaxy in a direction that will intersect with a name she has known about for her entire life. A name that the galaxy has known about for a very long time. A name that carries the peculiar gravitational weight of destiny, whether or not its current bearer wants anything to do with destiny. Skywalker. There it is, my dear subject, that name. It will not leave the galaxy alone, and the galaxy will not leave it alone. And that mutual inability to let go of each other has generated, over the course of several generations, an extraordinary amount of consequence. Darth Krayt was dying. I said this before, in our chapter about his origins, and I want to return to it now because in this chapter it becomes the engine of everything that follows. The Vong implants, that living tissue bonded to his body during the years of his captivity, had been spreading for decades. He had managed them. He had found techniques to slow them, practices that bought him additional time against the biological clock they represented. But slowing is not stopping. And after a century of slowing, the spreading had reached a threshold beyond which the old techniques were no longer sufficient. He was running out of options. He was running out of time. And Darth Krayt, who had survived everything the galaxy had offered him in the way of obstacles, did not intend to be defeated by his own biology after all of that. He had not built an empire in secret for 100 years to have the Vong get the last word. He needed a healer. Not any healer. The implants had been worked on by the best medical minds that his empire had access to, and the best medical minds had done what they could, and what they could do was not enough. He needed a healer who operated through the Force. There is a rare gift in the Force, a gift that appears perhaps once in a generation, perhaps less, that allows its practitioner to draw on the dark side's connection to life and death in a specific and extraordinary way, to knit damaged tissue, to reverse biological processes that should be irreversible, to reach into a living body and correct it at a fundamental level. It is the rarest of healing gifts, and it is dangerous to the healer as much as to anything else, because drawing on the connection between life and death through the dark side is not a clean transaction. It costs something. What it costs depends on how often it is used and how willingly. The person who had this gift, in the year 137 after the Battle of Yavin, was Cade Skywalker, grandson of a Skywalker, who was the grandson of a Skywalker, who was the son of the Chosen One himself, the lineage unbroken despite the galaxy's very energetic attempt to end it. Cade was the last of that line, or the latest of it, and the force that had concentrated itself in that bloodline across 4 generations had produced in him something spectacular and deeply unwanted. Spectacular because the raw power was there, the sensitivity, the potential, the ability to reach through the Force to places most practitioners could not reach. Deeply unwanted because Cade Skywalker wanted nothing to do with any of it. He had been a Jedi Padawan once. He had studied at the Jedi Academy on Ossus, the galaxy's great attempt to rebuild the Order in the post-Imperial era, under masters who were doing their best to restore something precious from the remnants of what Palpatine had destroyed. He had been, by all accounts, a student of considerable promise, not merely because of his bloodline, though his bloodline was impossible to ignore, but because of who he was, fierce and inventive, and not especially interested in the Jedi traditions for their own sake, but deeply connected to the Force in a way that was obvious to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive it. He was the kind of student who frustrated his teachers because he learned in his own order rather than theirs, and who produced results that his teachers could not quite argue with. A difficult student, the best kind. And then came the Battle of Ossus. Darth Krayt's forces attacked the Jedi Academy And in the carnage that followed, Cade's father, Cole Skywalker, a Jedi Master, a man who had given his adult life to the restoration of the Order, was killed. Killed by Darth Nil, Krayt's other hand, in a battle that was decisive and overwhelming and that the Jedi had no way of winning. Cade survived. A 14-year-old boy, watching his father die at the hands of a Sith Lord while the world he had been raised in burned around him. And then he ran. He ran in the way that people run when they are carrying something they cannot set down, not cleanly, not with a plan, but with the pure animal persistence of someone who has learned that the universe will take everything from you if you stop moving. He ran so far and so fast that he left himself behind. He became, over the years that followed, someone his teachers from Ossus would not have recognized. A pirate, a bounty hunter, a man who operated in the galaxy's underworld with his force sensitivity carefully suppressed and his lightsaber hidden and his famous name swallowed down into an identity so thoroughly constructed that most people who worked with him didn't know what he was. He had a crew, a Zeltron woman named Delia Blue, who was his mechanic and his complication, a man named Jariah Sin, who was his partner in the operational sense and his conscience in the grudging sense, the salvage ship Minok, which was the physical expression of the life he had built. He was trying very hard, my dear subject, to be no one, to be so ordinary that the galaxy's interest in him would simply lapse. The galaxy refused to cooperate. Darth Krayt knew about Cade because Krayt knew about everything. 100 years of building a secret empire teaches a person a great deal about the value of information. And the One Sith had intelligence networks that stretched into places most entities didn't know were worth watching. A Skywalker with a healing gift, living as a bounty hunter in the Outer Rim, this was not information that stayed secret for long, once the right eyes were looking for it. What Krayt needed was for someone to find Cade, not to kill him. Killing him would be easy and completely counterproductive. He needed Cade found and brought to him intact, and ideally not catastrophically traumatized in the process, because a healer who arrives at the Dark Lord's feet in pieces is not in an optimal condition to perform the extremely delicate force operation that the Dark Lord requires. This required a careful hand, a precise hand. Talon. Krayt gave her the mission in the way he gave all missions, precisely, completely, without excess explanation, trusting that the person he was sending had the intelligence to understand the implications that were not stated aloud. Find Cade Skywalker. Bring him to me. 5 words that encompassed, if you understood the context, an entire strategic necessity. Talon understood the context. She had been trained to understand the context of everything Krayt asked of her. She filed the information about Cade's healing gift next to the information about Krayt's Vong implants, and the connection was immediate and precise, and she understood exactly what was at stake. Not just Krayt's life, though that was certainly what was at stake at the level of the immediate transaction, but the entire project of the One Sith. Everything that had been built over a century. Everything that depended on Krayt's continued existence and continued will. She spent time preparing. Not because the mission was unusual for her. It was a more significant version of missions she had undertaken before, and the mechanics were familiar. But because Cade Skywalker was not an ordinary target. He was force-sensitive and trained, however reluctantly. He was a Skywalker, which meant the Force's investment in him was substantial, and the Force's investment in people tends to make them difficult to predict and more difficult to restrain than their circumstances suggest they should be. She read everything that existed about him, studied the patterns of his movement across the galaxy, tried to understand at the level of character and motivation what drove him, what he was running from, and what he was running toward, and where those two vectors intersected to create a predictable location. She was thorough. She was always thorough. It was one of the qualities that had made Krayt choose her. The hunt was beginning. And somewhere in the outer rim, aboard a salvage ship that smelled of engine oil and old decisions, a young man who wanted nothing to do with his name was about to discover that his name had found him anyway. Names always do, my dear subject. This is one of the kindly king's oldest observations. You can change what you call yourself. You can hide from everyone who knew you before. You can construct an identity so thoroughly different from your original one that your own mother might walk past you in a corridor. But what you are does not stop being what you are just because you have stopped acknowledging it. The Force knew what Cade Skywalker was, and now Darth Talon knew where to look. Sleep now, my young one. The hunt begins at dawn. Let the dark keep you until then. Chapter 8. A ghost who refuses to die. Welcome back, my dear subject. Settle in. The story has arrived at the part where things move, where the preparation of many chapters becomes action, where the hunter steps out of the shadows into the particular kind of attention that is required for pursuit. I will not tell this with the breathless pace of an action story, because that is not how I tell things, and it is not how this story wants to be told. I will tell it the way you experience a dream of motion. You are moving, there is direction, there is purpose, but the movement is smooth, and the world flows past you at the speed of attention rather than urgency. We are in pursuit, my young one, but we pursue as the dark side teaches, patiently, with full attention, without haste. The hunt for Cade Skywalker was not a simple matter of following a trail. Trails, in the conventional sense, require a quarry who is moving predictably, who has obligations or habits that create a detectable pattern. Cade had spent years erasing patterns, living in the margins of the galaxy where record-keeping was sparse and attention from central authorities was minimal, taking jobs from people who had good reasons for not advertising who they worked with, moving through the underworld with the ease of someone who had spent years learning its particular geography. He was genuinely hard to find, not impossible. Nothing that exists in the physical galaxy is truly impossible to find if you have the right resources and the right approach, but hard. The kind of hard that wears down ordinary investigators. The kind of hard that requires more than technique. Talon brought something to the hunt that most investigators did not have. She could feel the Force. And Cade, however much he was suppressing his connection to it, was still a Skywalker. Still a being in whom the Force had invested something extraordinary. Still a presence in the living web of energy that connected everything. You could not entirely hide that, no matter how carefully you shielded yourself. It was like trying to hide a fire by covering it with a cloth. The light was dimmer, yes, but the heat was still there if you were standing close enough. And Talon was trained to stand close enough to feel the heat of things that were doing their best not to be noticed. She followed the warmth of him across the galaxy's fringes, moving through systems and stations and ports that most maps didn't bother labeling with anything more than a number. She learned him in the process. This is the thing about a prolonged hunt. If you are paying proper attention, which Talon always was, you learn your quarry. You learn how they think, what they prioritize, where they take risks and where they exercise caution, what they are trying to protect, and what they have already given up on protecting. Cade Skywalker was trying to protect his crew. This was visible in his patterns. He took the jobs that paid well enough to maintain the ship and the people on it. He avoided situations that would draw attention to them. He chose ports that were complicated enough to make pursuit difficult, but safe enough not to be likely ambush sites. He was, despite everything he was pretending to be, still someone who cared about other people. Still someone who made decisions based on what he owed to the people around him. That was useful information. He was also self-destructive, my dear subject. That is the other thing that became clear in the pattern of his movements. A particular quality of risk-taking that went beyond what the job required. Situations that were more dangerous than they needed to be. Choices that put him in the path of things he should have avoided, given what he claimed to want. Anonymity, safety, the ordinary life of a competent operator in the underworld. He was, in some deep and unexamined way, testing the galaxy. Testing whether it would bother to respond to him, whether the force that he was suppressing would reassert itself if pushed hard enough. Whether perhaps someone would eventually come looking for him. Because a person who has been alone long enough sometimes creates conditions that make being found inevitable, even when they tell themselves that what they want is to stay lost. Cade Skywalker was not as finished with the Force as he pretended. He simply hadn't found a version of his relationship to it that he could live with. Talon filed this away carefully. It was important. A target who secretly wants to be found is a different problem from a target who genuinely doesn't. Not easier, necessarily, but different. The ambivalence was a tool, if handled correctly. It meant that confrontation did not have to be entirely force against force. There was a gap in Cade's defenses that was made of his own unresolved feelings, and a gap is always, potentially, an opening. She did not plan to exploit his ambivalence emotionally in the manipulative sense. That was not her approach. But she noted it. She noted that Cade Skywalker, beneath the carefully constructed identity of the underworld operator who wanted nothing to do with his name, was still a Jedi's son. Still someone who had been trained toward a purpose he had refused. Still, in some sense, incomplete. She tracked him to a station in the Outer Rim, one of those enormous constructed platforms that orbit dead stars, accumulating population and commerce, and the particular atmosphere of a place where a great many people are doing things they would prefer not to be specifically identified. She had been to such stations before. She found them useful. The chaos of them was a kind of cover, because her appearance, while striking enough that people noticed, was also strange enough that most people's nervous systems classified her as something to avoid looking at directly, rather than something to report to authorities. There are advantages, my young one, to looking like exactly what you are. People tend to get out of your way rather than ask questions. She moved through the station's lower levels with the particular efficiency of someone who has made a careful study of their destination, noting exits, noting the distribution of security presences, noting the angles of the docking approach that would give her the optimal position when the moment finally came. Everything she had learned about Cade over weeks of tracking was organized and ready, the way a well-prepared argument is ready, every piece in its place, every contingency considered. She found the Mynock berthed in a third-tier docking bay, which told her something about the current state of Cade's finances. She found his crew before she found him. The Zeltron woman Blue arguing cheerfully with a dock technician about a parts discrepancy that was clearly not the first parts discrepancy in their working relationship. The man Jariah Sin cleaning a weapon in the bay entrance with the practiced boredom of someone who cleans weapons to occupy the part of his brain that would otherwise think about things he doesn't want to think about. And she felt Cade before she saw him. That suppressed warmth, somewhere inside the ship, larger and more present than he would have wanted it to be. He was awake. He was tense. He knew somehow that something had changed. The Force always knows. She did not rush the approach. This is one of the things that distinguished Talon from less thoughtful operators. She understood that the final moment of a long hunt is not the time to introduce urgency. The urgency is already in the situation. Adding more does not help. What the final moment requires is precision. The precise expenditure of capability at the precise moment when it will be most effective. Neither a moment too soon, nor a moment too late. She had spent weeks following Cade Skywalker across the galaxy's margins. She had learned him. She had mapped the gaps in his defenses and understood the nature of his resistance. Now she was here, in the same station, with his ship within reach and his presence felt through the Force. The hunt was almost finished. What she felt from him, through the Force's connection, was not simple to characterize. He was afraid, not of her specifically, not yet, but of what she represented, which was the same thing he had been running from for years. The galaxy's insistence on having a use for him, on having a Skywalker-shaped need that required a Skywalker-shaped answer. And underneath the fear, something more complicated. A tiredness, perhaps. The exhaustion of someone who has been running long enough that some quiet, unacknowledged part of them has begun to wonder whether being caught might be simpler than continuing to run. She did not mistake that tiredness for surrender. She was too well trained for that. But she noted it. She noted everything. The confrontation, when it came, was quick. What preceded it, the approach through the station, the moment when Cade emerged from the ship and saw her standing in the bay entrance, the few seconds of absolute stillness where they looked at each other and the Force moved between them like the recognition of two things that have been pointed at each other across a very long distance. That moment was slow and strange and worth dwelling on. Two Force-sensitive beings assessing each other. One trained to absolute certainty about what she was doing there. The other surprised, genuinely surprised, even though some part of him had perhaps known this was coming, and afraid, and also somehow almost relieved. The relief of something over, finally, after years of anticipation. She had come a long way to find him, my dear subject, and she had found him exactly where the Force said he would be. Sleep now. Tomorrow we see what comes next. Chapter 9. What darkness recognizes in itself. Come close, my young one. This is the chapter where two extraordinary people share a space for the first time. And the kindly king wants to tell it carefully. Not with the hot pace of a conflict story, but with the attention it deserves. The patient attention you give to things that are significant. Significant moments do not always announce themselves with music and dramatic lighting. Sometimes they announce themselves with silence. With the stillness between two people who have just recognized something in each other that they did not expect to find. There are different kinds of recognition, my dear subject. Recognition of a name, recognition of a face, and then the stranger deeper recognition of encountering something in another person that you have only previously encountered in yourself. Cade Skywalker stood in the docking bay of the station and looked at the woman who had been hunting him. He had had perhaps 2 seconds of warning, the Force flickering at him in the way it always flickered when something important was about to happen, which was one of the reasons he had spent years resenting his own Force sensitivity. It was an unreliable system. It told you something was coming without telling you what, which meant you were afraid before you were informed, which was exactly the wrong order. She was not what he had expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he had expected. She was striking in a way that made the rest of the docking bay slightly less real by comparison. The red of her, the black script over the red of her, the 2 saber hilts at her sides, and the Force coming off her in a way that was not aggressive, but was absolute. She was not threatening him. She was simply existing in his space, and her existence was itself a kind of force. The fight, when it happened, was brief. Not because Cade was incapable. He was more capable than his months-long avoidance of anything lightsaber-related might suggest. The Jedi training was in his body, whether he acknowledged it or not. The muscle memory of years of practice not erasable simply by deciding not to practice. But he was fighting both Talon and himself, which is, my dear subject, a significant disadvantage. Every strike he made against her, some part of him was simultaneously debating whether it was worth making. Every defensive movement he managed, some part of him was already calculating the futility of the exercise. Talon had no such internal division. She was entirely here, entirely present, entirely committed. The fight between them was, in a sense, a fight between certainty and ambivalence. And certainty wins that fight more often than not. He was not destroyed. I want to be clear about that. Talon was not sent to destroy Cade Skywalker, and she performed her mission exactly as specified. She disarmed him, which required a level of precise combat skill that would have impressed anyone watching, and she restrained him, and she communicated to him in terms that were direct and not unkind what was going to happen next. Darth Krayt wished to meet him. He would be taken to Krayt. What happened after that was between Cade and the Dark Lord, and was not Talon's responsibility. Cade's crew, Blue and Sin, were not harmed. This was also deliberate, and not because Talon was feeling generous. It was because unnecessary casualties complicate the primary mission and give the quarry additional reasons for hostility that don't serve the intended outcome. She was methodical. She was always methodical. On the journey to Krayt, on the Sith ship moving through hyperspace toward the throne of the One Sith Empire, Talon observed Cade. This was not part of the mission exactly. The mission was to deliver him. But Talon had always observed, always attended closely to the things she encountered, and Cade Skywalker was an object of genuine interest to her. Not the kind of interest that softens a mission, but the kind that expands understanding. He was strange. The strangest thing about him was not the Skywalker name or the powerful Force presence that he couldn't quite conceal when he wasn't actively concentrating on concealing it. It was the disconnection, the gap between what he was and what he was choosing to be. She had never encountered anyone who was so clearly, obviously one thing while insisting on being another. She had been raised to be entirely what she was. Not as a virtue, exactly. The One Sith training was not sentimental about authenticity for its own sake. But as a practical matter, a Sith who is divided against themselves is a Sith who is vulnerable. And vulnerability in the One Sith's training system was addressed immediately and comprehensively. She had never had the option of being something other than what she was being shaped into. She had never been in a room with two versions of herself and been asked to choose between them. Watching Cade, she found herself, in some cool and detached part of her awareness, curious about what that was like, what it would feel like to carry that division, to have a self that kept insisting on surfacing regardless of how carefully you submerged it. To be haunted, essentially, by what you almost were. Darth Krayt received them in his throne room. The throne room of the One Sith Empire was designed, as throne rooms always are, to communicate something specific about the person at its center. In this case, weight. The weight of time, of endurance, of a long purpose finally achieved. Dark stone and Sith script and the kind of architectural seriousness that says, "We have been here a long time and we intend to remain." Krayt himself was difficult to see clearly for anyone not accustomed to looking at him. The armor, the Vong coral visible at the edges of it, the sense through the Force of an immense presence that was also unmistakably in pain. Not incapacitated pain, the kind of pain that has been carried so long it has become part of the body's normal operation, but present, real. The Dark Lord was suffering, and he had arranged his entire empire around the solution to that suffering. And now, the solution was standing in his throne room, looking neither grateful nor cooperative. Cade looked at Krayt for a long time, without speaking. And Krayt looked at Cade. And Talon, standing to one side in the role that was hers in that space, witness, presence, the physical manifestation of the Master's will that had made this moment possible, watched them both. What she observed was a recognition. Not a warm recognition, not the recognition of old friends, the recognition of two people who see in each other something that illuminates something in themselves. Krayt saw in Cade the answer to his problem, and also, Talon suspected, something that moved him in ways he had not expected. A Skywalker, the last of a line that had intersected with his own story at its most critical moments. And Cade saw in Krayt something that he had probably hoped, somewhere in the back of his determined denial, was not real. The evidence that the galaxy's interest in him was not abstract. It was right here, in this room, making it personal. There was a quality of stillness in that throne room that Talon found, in some analytical part of her awareness, unusual. She had attended meetings between Darth Krayt and many people, commanders transferring allegiance, officials of conquered governments, members of the One Sith hierarchy receiving new mandates. Those meetings had a different texture, the texture of power being exercised, of outcomes already determined. This meeting felt different. Krayt was not simply exercising power over Cade, he was, in some sense, asking something. And Cade, who had spent a decade refusing to be asked anything by the galaxy, was confronting the cost of that refusal. Neither of them was comfortable. Neither had quite the upper hand, despite appearances. Talon watched and noted everything. What was said between them, the specific words of that meeting, is not entirely what matters, my dear subject. The words are the surface of it. What matters is what was underneath the words. Two people who are both, in their different ways, in conflict with themselves. Krayt, who built an empire and a philosophy around the transcendence of individual will, confronted with the very individual and very urgent need of his own body. Cade, who built a life around refusing his own power, confronted with the specific use to which that power is being asked to be put. Neither of them was comfortable. Both of them were, in the most fundamental sense, exposed, stripped of the comfortable distance between what they tell themselves they are and what the situation is actually demanding of them. Talon watched all of this. She was present in the room the way a well-trained hand is present, attentive, ready, prepared to act if action became necessary, but understanding that this moment was not a moment for action. It was a moment for the things that she had been trained in less formally, for reading situations, for understanding what was happening at the level beneath the words, for being the intelligence that the master trusted to comprehend the full picture. She comprehended it. She comprehended it with the particular quality of attention that was her characteristic gift. Totally, precisely, without the distortion of hope or fear or investment in any particular outcome except the one that served her master's purpose. That was what she was for. That was what she had always been for. And for the first time in the cold, attentive quiet of that throne room, the kindly king wonders whether she ever wished, for even a fraction of a second, that she had been for something else. Sleep, my young one. Let that question rest beside you in the dark. Chapter 10. Written in red. Come, my young one, come to the last chapter. The kindly king has been telling stories for a long time, longer than most people live, longer than most of the political arrangements he has watched rise and fall, longer by far than the lifespan of any single empire. He has told stories about heroes and about people who chose not to be heroes, about creatures of light and creatures of darkness, and the much larger category of everyone in between. This last chapter is a quiet one. It is a chapter of reflection, of Darth Talon in a private moment, and of the kindly king speaking plainly about what this story means, or might mean, or refuses to quite mean, before we all go to sleep. After the throne room, after Cade Skywalker had been installed in whatever arrangement Darth Krayt had decided was appropriate for a recalcitrant healer who was simultaneously too valuable to harm and too dangerous to trust, Darth Talon returned to her quarters. These are not words you often see in association with Darth Talon. Her quarters. A private space. A space that belongs to her in some way that the throne rooms and mission briefings and docking bays of her professional existence do not. She had such a space. Everyone does, even beings who define themselves entirely through their function. Everyone has the hours when the function is temporarily set aside. And what those hours look like says something important about the person, even when the person would dispute that anything important can be learned from such a marginal time. Her quarters on the Sith flagship were spare. Not austere in the sense of hardship. They were comfortable enough, but uncluttered. Nothing unnecessary. No decorations, no collected objects, no evidence of accumulated sentimentality. The things she owned were the things she used. Weapons, armor, the minimal materials of a well-maintained operational existence. There was one exception. On a small shelf, accessible only by someone who knew it was there, a single object sat that was neither weapon nor tool. What it was exactly, whether a memento of training, a gift, a prize of some mission, something else entirely, the historical record does not tell us. But its presence tells us something, in the way that exceptions always tell us something. Even in the most carefully maintained simplicity, the self leaves traces. She sat. Meditation in the One Sith tradition was a practice, not the soft, inward-turned meditation of certain Jedi paths, but a rigorous exercise in self-examination, in the maintenance of the dark side connection, in the clearing of whatever had accumulated in the mind over the course of operations that demanded full attention for extended periods. Talon was good at meditation. She had been trained in it with the same thoroughness as everything else. But good at something and comfortable with something are not identical. And there were aspects of the meditative state that the One Sith training had not entirely anticipated. The things that surfaced when the operational focus was released, the observations that had been filed away during the mission, and which now, in the quiet, wanted to be examined. Cade Skywalker's face came to her. Not sentimentally, not with the particular warmth that would suggest something the kindly king would describe as an attachment, but precisely with the quality of attention she had given him throughout the mission, analytically, as an object of study that had yielded unusual findings. He was the first Force-sensitive being of his level that she had spent significant time with who was not a Sith. She had encountered Jedi before, in the course of her operations, but those encounters had been brief and combative, and not conducive to the kind of extended observation she had given Cade. He had surprised her. Not tactically, she had anticipated his capabilities correctly enough, but in the quality of his interior life, the particular texture of what it meant to carry a Force gift that you were in open conflict with. She had not known before that such a conflict was possible. She turned this over carefully. The One Sith's training had given her a very complete model of what a Force-sensitive being was, what the Force was, what it did to those it inhabited, what those beings did with it in turn. But that model, she recognized now, was built entirely from the One Sith's experience, which was a very particular slice of the larger range of experience available. The Jedi model was different, not just in its ethics and its practices, but in its fundamental understanding of what the Force wanted from the beings it chose. And there was at least one more model, which was Cade's model, which was something like, the Force wants something from me and I decline, and the Force and I are having an ongoing argument about whether my declining matters. She had never declined. The possibility of declining had not been part of her education. She was not certain, sitting in the quiet of her quarters, whether that absence was a loss or a protection or simply a fact. Devon Izara came to her too, in the meditation. Not literally. Devon and Talon had never met, were separated by more than a century, but as a concept. As the other person in the kindly king's story, the counterpoint to Talon's own existence. A girl who lost everything and has been trying to figure out who she is without the structure of what she lost. Talon had never lost anything in that sense. She had been given everything she was from the beginning, with no alternatives offered. No choice about the structure she lived inside. Which was, she recognized in the cool, analytical way that was the only way she examined such things, its own kind of loss. The loss of the self that might have existed if the world had been different. If Korriban had not been her beginning. If the One Sith had not been her horizon. She could not miss that self. She had never met it. The kindly king wants to say something direct now, my dear subject, before the night is over. He has been telling you about darkness all evening, about the philosophy and practice and product of the dark side, about the extraordinary and terrible thing that Darth Talon is. He does not want you to leave the story with a simple feeling about it. Not horror, not admiration. Neither of those is the right register. What Darth Talon's story asks of us, I think, is something more honest than horror or admiration. It asks us to reckon with what it means to be made, to acknowledge that not everyone who does dark things chose the darkness in any simple sense, that some people were given the darkness the way they were given their first language, before they had any basis for comparison, and built their entire selves from it. That is not exculpation. What she did was what she did, and the people on the receiving end of it do not benefit from the explanation of her formation. But it is a truth, and the kindly king trades in truth, even when it is inconvenient. Devon Izara, out there in the early empire, will make choices in the years ahead. She will choose what to do with what remains of her after everything she was trained to be was taken from her. The story of those choices is still being written, and the kindly king has every confidence that it will be a story worth telling. And Darth Talon, in the Legacy era, in the age of the One Sith's long dominion and eventual reckoning, will continue to serve, to pursue, to be the will that is not her own. She will be extraordinary at it. She was made to be extraordinary at it. These are two answers to the same question. What do you do when the galaxy uses you in ways that are not of your choosing? You survive, like Devon, or you serve, like Talon, or perhaps in the best of cases, you find something else entirely, something that is neither the survival of someone dispossessed, nor the service of someone who was never given the option of having a self. Something worth the having. But that is a thought for a different night. Tonight we have done what we set out to do. We have told the story of Darth Talon, the Scarlet Lady, the Inscribed One, the Red Woman of the Legacy era, who was made by darkness into something extraordinary and terrible. And we have held Devon Izara alongside her, like a lamp beside a mirror, so that each illuminates the other. Two women, 2 centuries, 2 answers to the question of what you become when everything is taken or given or shaped around you. The galaxy will go on turning, my dear subject. It always does. And somewhere in it, in their different ages, a girl is running and a woman is standing still. And the force is moving through both of them, regardless of what they want from it. Let your eyes close now. Let the story fold into you the way stories do. Not in the part of you that follows logic, but in the deeper part that holds what matters, without being able to say exactly why it matters. Devon Izara will find her way in her time. Darth Talon will serve in hers. And the galaxy will keep being the complicated, beautiful, terrible thing it has always been, full of people made by circumstances and people who made themselves, and the much larger category who were partly both. That group, my young one, that is most of us. Sleep now. Let the dark be gentle. Sleep. Good night.